Okay, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Emotional Intelligence at Work, Self-Regulation Tips and Strengths-Based Tools. My name's Carly Hansen and I'm one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators at Community Legal Centres Queensland. I'd firstly like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar. I'm here today in Meanjin in Brisbane, and we have the Turrbal and the Yagara people whose lands we are gathered on. I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that these are stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. As today's webinar is being viewed by people throughout Queensland and Australia, I'd also like to pay my respect to the traditional owners throughout the country and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people who are joining us today. So I'd like to welcome in a moment Jan Ungara, the Director of Insightful Communications, who will be presenting today's webinar. So she'll be talking about how emotional intelligence underpins our capacity to work well with others, manage stress and make effective decisions. Today's webinar with Jan will showcase how emotional intelligence can help all of us, including managers and leaders and staff in community legal centres and other areas, to better connect to the challenges of the moment, including taking us through what emotional intelligence is and its importance in the workplace, reading emotions as data to help us think and act more intelligently, recognising our own emotional states and the impact on performance, providing practical self-regulation tips and strengths-based tools to take away and apply in our own context. And today's webinar is part of CLCQ's Mental Health and Wellbeing CPD program, which was developed to assist frontline CLC workers to manage the impacts of COVID-19, and is supported by a grant from the Queensland Community Foundation, which we're really fortunate to have. So you can see on the screen there's just a few housekeeping tools, which I'll quickly take us through before I hand over to Jan to tell you a little bit more about herself and take us through the presentation in just a minute. So today's webinar is being recorded, and I'll have that recording available for people to view tomorrow morning, and I'll send a link out to everyone who's registered with that link, the recording. The PowerPoints have been emailed out to everyone who has registered as of yesterday, and they're also available to download from our website and from the handouts section of the GoToWebinar control panel. They have been slightly updated, just some of the poll questions. So if you got them yesterday through email, you might want to just grab the newest version in the handout section on that panel. So we encourage you to engage in today's session. Jan will be asking a couple of questions throughout, so you can use the chat box to type in your responses if you wish, but no pressure. And if you do have any other questions, you can also put those into the chat, and we'll come to those at the end. So as I mentioned, there will be a poll today, so it'd be great if you could pop your response into the poll so that we can have a bit of a discussion about that. And I think now I will be able to hand over to Jan, and I'll come back at those couple of intervals and at the end of the session. Looks like we've just lost Jan's presentation. Oh no, here we go. Hopefully it's back up again. Jan, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. Yeah, look, thank you, Carly and the Community Legal Centres Queensland, and of course, along with everybody that's tuned in for today's conversation. Firstly, I'd just also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we live and recognise that this land has always been under their custodianship. And I pay my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past and present, and to all emerging community leaders. And I am here sitting on Bunjalung country, just over the beautiful Tweed River in northern New South Wales. So welcome to everybody, and from wherever and what country you join us on today. So that's me, Jan, as you can see, and I run a small consultancy called Insightful Communications, and we work with projects and people and learning partners who are focused on their leadership, collaborating, wellbeing for all, and co-create ways to strengthen service delivery. I wanted to include this slide of just some learning partners because it is through these learning partners and working with them closely that we get to learn from one another. And over time and working across all of these different health and community service and not-for-profit sectors, we've found appreciative ways and ways of working that help better assist and strengthen better outcomes for clients and, of course, the communities that each of these organisations serve to strengthen their service delivery. So great privilege to be here today, and as Carly mentioned, we've got a couple of polls and along the way a couple of questions which I would love your input if you feel like sharing as we go, just to keep some of that engagement happening whilst we can't see one another. Certainly we know that we're all here in this together, listening together. And so any people that would like to share, yes, please, please do so. The aim of today is to support you to just increase that confidence, maybe some communication techniques and strategies to perceive, to use, to understand, and of course to regulate emotions. And we'll look at how emotional intelligence sort of underpins our capacity to work really well with others, to manage our stress levels, and of course to make better and effective decisions. And of course we'll practice as we go some self-regulation tips. As I understand, and certainly from last time that we were in conversation together, recognise that some of the interactions that you may find yourselves in can be at times quite challenging, and add this to the significant focus of the work around advocacy appearing in courts or tribunals, that those challenges of staying focused and calm under pressure, particularly with unexpected turns that those types of encounters sometimes take, is really, really critical in maintaining our capacity to meet the moment as we are and as it is. And so by developing our emotional intelligence, it means that we are better able to support ourselves in these moments and of course others, and not just to kind of be healthy, but to actually really thrive in the face of change and ambiguity and challenge. And by doing so, we also have greater capacity then to withstand how those changes in the environment happen and continue to function effectively. Of course, our resilience has certainly been tested in recent times, and I think emotional intelligence as a skill that can be learned and supported with targeted actions is becoming more and more critical to the way in which we want to be in our work. So what it covers today, as Carly mentioned a little bit before, we're defining it, its importance in the workplace, how to read emotions as data to help us think and act more intelligently, and of course to recognise our own emotional states and the impact that that has on performance. We know that we need to work to create emotionally constructive climates that help kind of predict and support our workplaces, and the degree to which we can manage our own stress and feelings will have a proportional impact on those around us. The reason why emotional self-awareness in particular and mindfulness are so important is because we all act as emotional beacons, and I'll talk to some of the stats about that a little bit later. Emotional intelligence, we know, begins with self-awareness, so emotional awareness, getting in touch with your inner voice, let's say, and those who heed their inner voices can draw on more resources to make better decisions and connect with more of their authentic selves. When we zero in on our sensory impressions of ourselves in the moment, that's one element of self-awareness. Another, though, is combining our experiences over time into a more coherent view of ourselves as authentic selves. And what we mean by authentic is to be the same person to others as you are to yourself. In part, that means we pay attention, or we are always paying attention, I should say, to what others think of us, particularly people whose opinions that we value and who will be candid, let's say, in their feedback. And a variety of the focus that's useful here to think about is open awareness, in which we broadly notice what's going on around us without getting caught up or swept away by any one particular thing. In this mode, we're not judging, censoring, or tuning out, we're simply perceiving. Someone who might have a little bit of trouble, let's give an example here of sustaining that open awareness, will typically get caught up in the irritating details. So an example might be fellow travellers in the airport security line who are taking forever at getting their carry-on into the scanner. Someone who can keep their attention in that open mode will notice those travellers but not worry about them, as they'll take in more of the surroundings around them. Today, to get us started, I wanted to add in this little connecting activity, and this is right up front that opportunity for a little bit of self-regulation practice. And just wherever you are, if you are sitting on a chair, just want you to follow these instructions on the screen. And of course, this will help us settle in well with one another today and kind of develop that open awareness principle that we just talked about. So let's just take a moment. Lengthen our spine. We want to just sit light and long here. And we're just going to inhale gently, bringing our attention to the belly. And as we breathe out, we want it to be a long and slow breath, maybe with a slight pause. I've suggested 5 seconds or more. If that feels too much, just go with what's naturally comfortable. And as you inhale, try and lower and slow the breath down. So just begin to notice, and we may then refocus our attention. Just begin to notice what happens for you. Maybe nothing, maybe you sense a little bit more calmer, you are a little bit more present to the moment. Just in principle, we know that doing these kinds of self-regulation or vagal tone exercise, as it's called, helps us connect better with the moment that we're in. One of the things we know about emotional intelligence, and we'll explore this in more depth in a moment, is that we must manage ourselves first before we can manage others. There is this palpable kind of inner atmosphere created when we move from the busy doing part of our lives into just being, pausing, and this ability to digest the present moment as it is. What we are practicing here is, as I said, increasing our vagal tone. And to increase our vagal tone, we do it through exercising, meditation, gratitude, awareness, these kinds of practices of self-regulation. And by increasing our vagal tone, it helps balance our ability to access our parasympathetic response that's actually needed for resting and responding from a more grounded, centered place. Vagus means wanderer, so it's aptly named. It forms at the brain stem at the base of the skull, and the vagus travels in 2 directions, downward through the lungs, heart, diaphragm and stomach, and upward to connect with nerves in the neck, throat, eyes and our ears. And this vagus being divided into 2 parts means we've got the ventral vagal pathway and the dorsal vagal pathway. The ventral vagal pathway, which is what we were practicing, responds to our cues of safety, connection, and supports those feelings of being safely engaged and, of course, socially connected, which we are all here today. In contrast, the dorsal vagal pathway will respond to cues of extreme danger, and it takes us out of connection, out of awareness, and into our protective state of collapse. So we might feel frozen or numb or not really here. And when we're feeling like that, we know that the dorsal vagal has taken control. So now that we're feeling a little, hopefully, more present to the moment, I'd just like you to focus here on the poll that Carly's going to assist us with. And what two statements from the ones below stand out for you when you think of emotional intelligence and how you apply it in the workplace? So we'd love your input here to see what's kind of coming up for us as a group.
Thanks, Jan. So that poll, so that poll should be up on your screen now, and I can see some people are voting, which is great. For those of you who just would like it to be read out, so the options there for you to pick two of include applies a common sense approach to things, works on developing people skills, manages stress well, copes with challenges and situations as they arise, and listens empathetically. So I'll give you maybe another 20 seconds to complete that. I've got 60% of people that have voted so far, which is awesome.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Carly. Thanks, everybody. Give you a little bit.
Okay, so I might close that poll down in 5 seconds, and then I'll share those results so that we can see how we went.
Wonderful.
All right, just closing that poll now. And Jen, I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see this on the screen, but just in case.
I can.
You can? Great. So it looks like the top one there copes with challenges and situations as they arise, and I'll let you talk through what you see.
Wonderful. There. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for participating and sharing your top two. And we seem to have, some standout results in terms of 76% of you are thinking about how you cope with challenges and situations as they arise. And then next we've got that listening empathetically, which would suggest, of course, very much ties to the work in which you are involved in, and that coping with challenges and situations, you've built some pretty good muscles in relationship to that, and of course that listening to others. And then if we've got working on people skills and managing stress well, sort of closely aligned there. And then this applying a common sense approach to thing in terms of how emotional intelligence looks and feels to you in that day-to-day kind of practice of it might be less so. But still, of course, a decent number of people there thinking about that notion of that ability to read the play and read the room and respond accordingly with a common sense approach. And so thank you very much. You know, by connecting to these statements for us, we get to understand, I guess, of what's of greatest importance, you know, what reflects well with us as a collective. And it also helps normalise some of the things that we might be thinking about emotional intelligence and its place in our work. What we know and what we've said before, that self-awareness piece is the foundation of emotional intelligence, and increasing it isn't always an easy part, but we know that it can be learned as well. People with high emotional intelligence are often described as aware, authentic, empathetic, expansive, resilient, empowered, centered, rather than those other words like disconnected, guarded, insensitive, limited, temperamental, reactive. With insight into ourselves and others, we clearly recognise that the emotions will drive our thinking and behaviour, and then we use that information and that understanding to generate more positive outcomes for whatever situation we find ourselves in. And of course, when we're attuned to emotions that can disrupt our engagement and productivity with others, people who have that ability and that emotional intelligence are able to then convert fears and concerns into opportunity and can frame challenges constructively, which is, I think, what I hear coming out of that poll even, that you are coping with these challenges and situations as they arise. And so you will be doing some of that ability to convert others' fears and concerns into these opportunities and frame those challenges constructively. We hear from Daniel Goleman, and we'll look at some of the other people involved in that sort of emotional intelligence field in the next slide. But in practice, people with emotional intelligence skills are more able to accurately assess the situation, determine appropriate responses, and keep things in perspective. And I think that reflects a little on what we just saw in the poll before as well. By better understanding and meeting those human needs, we build relationships that will inspire and energise more commitment, trust, and of course, that productivity or performance. What we know was once considered an intangible determinant of success beyond IQ, education, experience, and personality, emotional intelligence is accurately measured now and developed. And whilst it isn't the sole predictor of human potential, it is definitely proven to be a key leading indicator. And the good news is that it isn't fixed. It can change and get developed over time and with targeted actions. Emotional intelligence has also been shown to be that stronger predictor of success in work rather than IQ or experience alone. And emotional intelligence is the glue that enables cross-team, cross-sector collaboration and non-siloed thinking. So let's look at a few ideas here and what emotional intelligence is. I've decided to use this definition of emotional intelligence for the purpose of today's workshop and webinar. However, there are many, many, as you can imagine, definitions of emotional intelligence. This one describes it as a set of emotional and social skills that influence the way we do these things, perceive and express ourselves, develop, maintain social relationships, cope with those challenges, and use the emotional information in an effective and, of course, meaningful way. The Langley group talks about emotional intelligence as this intelligent use of emotions and how it underpins our capacity to work well with others, manage stress, and make effective decisions. Stephen Stein talks about emotional intelligence as the ability to identify and manage emotional information in oneself and others, and to focus energy on the required behaviours that we're looking for. It's important to note that many of these different definitions of emotional intelligence makes some reference and places the emphasis on the social impact or the social skills. Because we're ultimately social beings, and including in the workplace, our ability to manage relationships in ourselves is paramount to our success. We know that human beings are hardwired to unconsciously pick up on the emotions of others in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second. So let's just kind of sit with that figure for a moment. 8 to 40 thousandths of a second, we're hardwired to unconsciously pick up on the emotions of others. I guess that really struck me because it's it helped raise the question for me about what then are the implications for any of us, and in the work, of course, that we are doing on a day-to-day basis. So I'll just leave you with that question. And as we go into the next slide, sorry, and just take us back there for a moment. If I can. I'm not sure, Carly, how I can go back to the
you want to go
slide.
back one slide?
I do.
Yeah, you should be able to just arrow back and forth if you just click on that. Yep.
There we go. Got it. Thank goodness for Carly. This 20-second pause and reflect. So I just want you now to just sit with what you've heard so far and think about what might be your greatest opportunity here for growth or self-improvement when you think of your ability to manage your emotions and your relationships. So what I thought we might do is take 20 seconds. That's probably long enough. For those of you who like to write things down, you might just scribble on a piece of paper. If you're brave enough and anybody would like to share their thoughts in the chat function, remembering that you are de-identified, we would love to hear from you too. So just consider what might be something that you are either currently working on or that you notice in yourself is an opportunity for growth or self-improvement when you think of your ability to manage your emotions and your relationships. I'll just give you a moment. It's not always easy to identify how you're feeling a lot of the time. But of course, we can start by paying attention to the impact that we're having on other people. When you're maybe leading a discussion in a team meeting, or you find yourself reacting strongly to someone who's raising an issue, or you might have to give negative feedback, whatever it might be, you could start to pay attention to their reaction. And this response might contain information for you. Remember, we talked about emotions contain data. So we look for emotions equals information. Look inside and see what that tells you about how you're feeling in any given moment. Anybody, Carly, had a share via the chat function?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts coming through. So I'm not going to name anybody, just by the way. So feel free to share, and no one else will be able to see your comment. One person has said that they would like to work on their level of frustration when people don't act quickly enough for them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and another has mentioned that it's really important for them to keep a good relationship with clients and others that they work with in a various range of settings, including courts, police, health, education, etc. And just sort of remaining very professional in that kind of setting as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so that relationship, absolutely, those critical relationships that we have, and what is that to be responding to others in these sometimes complex and challenging situations that can arise from time to time. And I absolutely, yes, get that level of frustration. And we'll talk to some of this, and hopefully there's some thoughts in the presentation today that may assist.
And Jan, I might just share a couple more that have come through, if that's all right, really quickly.
Please.
So being less emotionally reactive in challenging or negative situations was one. Another was responding to misinformation in the office. So, this one's not really about clients, I suppose, working with other people instead. And learning to think before speaking and taking time to respond before letting out any frustrations, and sometimes also moving out from the situation, so moving physically away from the situation. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. I'll close that one off now, but feel free to keep sharing if you wish.
Thanks so much, Carly. Yeah, some great and brave and courageous responses there of these everyday things that get us. And I love the word somebody's used, the responding, because we know that when we're in reaction, that's information to us. And what are those sort of self-regulation tips and tools and tricks and strategies that we learn for ourselves that work, where we can do some of that pause, that breathe, that, and we'll talk about a few more ideas coming up when we share a case study of a manager of a small to medium organisation. So thank you very much, and that will help us as we move along throughout today to keep this in mind, that there are some things here that we know we can always work on. Of course, we've said about that, building our confidence and knowing that emotional intelligence is this dynamic and not static thing, and it can be learned, and we can change it and respond differently and better. There's also some benefit that I just want to talk about here in this moment of what we've just done here by pausing and reflecting, and this role that pausing plays in our emotional well-being and capacity for self-regulation is really important. The power of the pause, you may have heard it referred to, it means that not only does pausing promote a sense of relaxation, a break from the noise and the doing, it in fact can refresh us and re-energize us for hours, some suggest. So think about those moments. We've done a 20-second pause and reflect here. Think about when you, in your everyday, get to pause and simply reflect before you respond. So the emergence of emotional intelligence, we'll go through a little bit of that emergence from the 1980s, when it was first used in a doctoral dissertation by a fellow called Wayne Payne. In 87, another fellow used the term emotional quotient. In the 90s, there were different psychologists who published some articles around emotional intelligence, and it was their thoughts were about how the ability to monitor one's own and others' feelings and emotions, how to discriminate among them, and to use that information to guide one's thinking and actions. And in 95, of course, Goleman wrote the book about emotional intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ, and really popularised, I guess, this notion of emotional intelligence, particularly in areas that were in the public interest and were becoming more important in the fields outside of psychology, like education and business. Then we had Dr. Reuven Bar-On, who was an Israeli psychologist and one of the leading pioneers and theorists and researchers in emotional intelligence, that developed this rigorous and evidence-based EQI 2.0 model that you see on the screen. And he did this in 1997. We're going to use this model while we look at emotional intelligence through the lens of this. And in subsequent slides, I'm going to use a case study to demonstrate and to give some examples of what occurs in the social impact in the areas of emotional self-awareness, emotional self-expression, and self-regulation or impulse control in our decision-making. The EQI model is generally regarded as the most robust and accurate way to measure EQ. It generates an overall score of somebody's emotional intelligence and is based on these 5 composite separate areas that you'll see: self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal, decision-making, stress management. And then each of those is made up of these 3 subscales as per the diagram. As I said, it's a snapshot of one's emotional intelligence. It starts with the self-perception, and then, of course, as we understand ourselves better, we're more likely to express ourselves better. We move around to the self-expression scale, it then leads to healthier interactions with others, leads us into our interpersonal skills, which of course leads to making better decisions. When we make good decisions, it allows us to manage our stress better, which leads to understanding our emotions better, and so on. This is a dynamic model. Each facet relies on and influences the other. It works together to create healthy emotional intelligence, so none is more important than the other. And of course, when the wheel is being balanced, it can run evenly. Part of being certified in this model means it's become a really useful coaching tool with leaders when I'm working with leaders and managers, and it can help inform them of areas for growth with some real strategies that are tailored to that individual's working life context. With their consent, I've chosen to share a recent report of a manager of a medium-sized human service organisation who undertook a 6-month-long external supervision program with me. And we began by discussing their high and low subscale scores to help us decide what would be best to work on. Remembering that this model and many other psychometric tools provide us just an overall snapshot of a person's emotional intelligence at a moment in time. And of course, the real value of using these types of emotional intelligence models is that it's in the conversation and identifying opportunities for reflection and for action. We're going to be looking at these 3 areas in the subscales: emotional self-awareness, emotional expression, and of course, as I said, in the decision-making composite, the subscale of impulse control. So for the sake of discussing this case study, let's call them Charlie. So Charlie came to me because the board had recognised there'd been some significant growth of staff side, some big organisational commitments, and it was requiring some new management and leadership strategies, and Charlie was in a state of overwhelm. It had also come to their attention that there were some identified patterns of behaviour that were requiring further attention as staff morale was quite low. Feedback was suggesting there were some real challenges in the ways things were being communicated and decisions being made with very little or no input from the staff, and of course what those implications meant for the whole. And communication was going to be a key aspect to getting better outcomes for everybody, including those utilising the services, as well as, of course, building a more harmonious and trusting and healthier team culture. In our first debrief conversation, Charlie chose to work on these 3 lower subscales and consider their impact. In the next few slides, we'll look at some strategies that we used that really helped Charlie to think about and respond differently in regards to these 3 subscales. It meant that by developing the areas of emotional self-awareness, emotional expression and impulse control, meant Charlie was better able to understand how and what they were experiencing moment to moment via their bodily sensations and emotions, as of course we know that they were impacting not only themselves but others around them, and of course the environment in which they were in and worked. Each moment was an opportunity then for Charlie to become more self-aware. One of the strategies that we looked at using to get a better understanding of that moment-to-moment experience was we applied the 90-second rule. So feelings are like ocean waves, says psychologist Alison Stone. They rise, crest and recede all day long, and we can all relate. But according to the brain scientist Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor, these waves last just 90 seconds. After that, we are re-stimulating our internal circuitry. Explains Taylor, when a person has a reaction to something in their environment, there's a 90-second chemical process that happens in the body. And after that, any remaining emotional response is just the person choosing to stay or be caught in that emotional loop. She says that something happens in the external world, the chemicals are flushed through the body, which puts it on full alert. For those chemicals to totally flush out of the body, it takes less than 90 seconds. It means that for 90 seconds, you can watch the process happening, you can feel it, and then you can watch it go away. After that, if you continue to feel fear, anger, frustration, and so on, we need to look at the thoughts that we're thinking and that are re-stimulating the circuitry, because that's resulting in us having this ongoing physiological reaction over and over again. We know that what keeps emotions lingering are the stories that we tell ourselves about them. We're humans, we're story-making machines. We often tend to interpret our body's signals as emotions when in fact they are just processes happening. They will pass unless, of course, we attach a story to them and keep them alive. It is something that we can all do to kind of help us make sense of our emotional lives, is to think of the brains are like Teflon for positive experiences, which means they sort of slide off quite quickly, and they're Velcro for negative, which means negative thoughts and emotions will stick to us longer. This idea of the 90-second rule was a bit of a game changer for Charlie. As a manager who saw themselves as needing to have more answers than not, every time somebody brought a challenge, a concern, or simply wanted to vent, Charlie had a story that they needed to fix things, and quickly. As Charlie started to experiment with noticing what happened when an emotion of frustration or anger arose, they gave themselves this opportunity to pause and see if they could better ride the wave whilst recognising any of the thought patterns, that story making that was keeping them in reaction. That pause moment and staying with the discomfort of the emotion without trying to avoid or to fix it meant Charlie was more able to meet the moment with some greater awareness and empathy for themselves, and start to accept that responding rather than reacting was actually a possibility. That feeling of sort of being under pressure to come up with the answer started to ease. So maybe you'd like to consider practicing the 90-second rule sometime this week. When stress hits and you feel yourself launching into a full-on fight or flight mode, go back to the principle of the pause. Inhale, exhale, try and extend that exhalation breath like we did at the beginning. We're increasing our vagal tone, and then we allow ourselves to feel the tension without expecting ourselves to respond immediately to the situation confronting you. You can see now we're starting to form this first-hand understanding and to practice some emotional self-awareness techniques. Knowing when and how to be more self-aware of your emotions and to express yourself well will help you get the most out of your emotions, from building those authentic relationships to getting the work done. And emotions will prioritise what you need to pay attention to. And of course, so the more we practice these things, the more proficient we become, and the greater our capacity to recognise the space between the stimuli and our response to that stimuli, ensuring a more conscious and skillful approach. Without emotional self-awareness, it's really difficult to become proficient in and consistently use other emotional and social intelligence competencies. I am human, 1, 2, 3, I am human. This technique came from Deb Dana, who has written a book called Befriending the Nervous System. It's another technique that Charlie started to incorporate into their day-to-day to build on their emotional self-awareness skills and self-regulation, and of course their emotional expression. As we said, the emotions contain data about ourselves, other people, and the world around us. They attribute value to our choices, enabling us to navigate daily life safely and effectively. Remaining open to feelings gives us some valuable early data points that helps us to think and act more intelligently. In these moments of protection, Charlie was able to focus in on increasing the vagal tone through different exercises like we've discussed, and simply allow themselves to return back to the regulation. So what we do in the 1, 2, 3, we say, I am in reaction. We give ourselves recognition. We know that there are protective parts of us that have been there for good reason in the past. They may not necessarily be needed in the future, but we simply just begin to recognise, give ourselves that recognition, and just we might start to even name the emotion. So I am in reaction, we recognise. This is human. We give ourselves some self-compassion. We're all in this together. Remember, 8 to 40 thousandths of a second, we are hardwired unconsciously to respond to others. And of course, this ventral vagal reconnection about that, how can I return to myself? I ask what I can do is, and so I apply some self-agency here. We then started to look at a feeling circle to increase Charlie's emotional expression. So putting words to our feelings isn't always easy for some of us. It is natural to others. But when we're trying to exchange words with someone that we care about on issues packed with emotional complexity, it can be really challenging to navigate. And it's all about how we navigate those relationships, like you have already identified. Back to the case study, Charlie recognised early on their emotional expression was always in the limelight, and while some situations called for them to instantly express themselves, most required a more deliberate and controlled expression. Remember, your genuine expression and authenticity will be actually really appreciated by others, especially when it's timely and constructive. We discovered this feeling circle tool became invaluable for Charlie's emotional communication and her emotional expression. The feeling circle was originally developed by a psychotherapist named Dr. Gloria Wilcox to facilitate better verbalisation of emotions by people that she was working with. We know using intellectual language, words that aren't necessarily connected to our direct experience, will distance us from our emotions and makes it more difficult to know what we're truly feeling. And of course, that then has an impact on others, trying to work out what it is that is happening and how we're feeling. To avoid this, just try using simpler, more self-expressive words, emotional language, if you like, to explain what you feel. The circle provides some more emotional words that you can say in place of intellectual ones. So the idea here is you feel the thing. When a feeling starts to arise, look at the wheel. You get to the core feeling first if you can. Start with the innermost wheel and move outward, moving from the core feeling toward any associated feelings that might be coming up. Charlie was able to talk through this notion of feeling frustrated and angry in the moment. They were under stress. There were lots of decisions that had to be made. Pressures were mounting. And there was this just sense of there was never enough time to get it all done. So just being able to recognise the anger as an emotion and then move into words that kind of resonated differently with Charlie. They got to this frustration and critical and realised that as they explored those two feeling words, what was coming up for them, and in fact how they were behaving toward others was looking quite dismissive, as they themselves were feeling dismissive and criticised. So there was this really interesting parallel process going on where the emotions that Charlie was experiencing in those moments were being felt by others as almost the same things. And so there it gave some context for Charlie to think about having this repertoire and this body of emotional language that they could get to more quickly, and also to help others by watching the impact of whatever was happening in the moment for them. The other part of this was the how do you feel question. If a core emotion isn't always clear, you can move from the outside in, identifying the associated feeling first and then making your way toward the core emotion. You don't have to hunt for the right word, rather it's just you notice what's resonating with you. And then the other part to this chart was to compare how you're feeling today with how you might have felt earlier today or even yesterday. So, for example, you might say, I'm feeling, and you use the feeling wheel. And you might, but yesterday I felt, and so you can use it, and typically you might find that there are 2 or even 4 different emotions that might apply. So what are some of your techniques for effective emotional communication? I wanted to, and I'm realising time is ticking on here, so I'd just like to quickly show the NAB, but I won't necessarily talk to that too much. You've got that on your slide, and you can see it's a easy to remember process about name the strong emotion, accept it, and breathe. It's just another little technique that you might consider using. What I wanted to do here was to just pause for a moment and see if anybody would like to share if there's been a phrase, an idea, a strategy that stood out for them when they think of emotional intelligence. So I'll just give you a moment, if you like, just to share anything that you've heard today that has stood out or resonates for you. What are we learning? Anybody willing to share there, Carly?
Not so far, Jen, but perhaps
No
if you want to
problem.
keep chatting through and we can come back to these
Definitely.
at the
If you
end.
have some, that'd be great if you have any thoughts. So here are some 5 powerful questions, and we've got these from that EQI model of emotional intelligence that was used with Charlie. The other part of Charlie's low subscales was the impulse control, and that is that ability to think before acting, to show restraint in the face of any impulse or temptation to act. And in Charlie's own words, when we first met, they said, I'm like a bull at a gate. I am very passionate about what I do, and I know that sometimes that impulsivity, how I make decisions on the fly, can sometimes cause some concern. And so this became something that came out in the score for Charlie, and they really wanted to work on and have a bit more of a moderate amount, let's say, of control over their behaviour, and notice that really was an area that was worth improving. So the act now, think later approach to solving some problems and decisions needed some work. They started by doing a bit of an impulse inventory, so impacting how others viewed their composure, and that was really enlightening to them. So asking for others' feedback, which helps us to kind of think about, am I realistic about how I perceive myself? So when we get feedback from others whose opinions we respect or we listen to, it's a really useful way. Also, that we admit any mistakes. I think one of the best things we can do, particularly with our best intentions or frustration, impatience, we all can go there sometimes. It can all get the better of us. But by showing some integrity and owning our behaviours and emotions, and admitting to things helps recover from workplace slip-ups with less wear. And there's a lovely quote that one of the leaders I recently had some time working with talked about. For her and her team, they used to talk about rupture is repairable. It does, however, require that there's some trusted environment in order to do that repair. I'll just like to finish here and to go back over some of the things that we have talked about today in perceiving emotions. This is that ability to accurately recognise how you and others are feeling, and it includes this ability to read other people's facial expressions to better understand what they might be experiencing. What are some of these strategies that you have for managing emotions, and how do we all avoid reactive outbursts and manage our emotions more effectively in the moment? How do we use our emotions? Sensing and generating emotions and integrating them strategically will help enhance our thinking, our reasoning, our problem solving, and of course, our creativity. How we apply words to emotions and to our understanding of emotions, the conceptual knowledge of emotions, how they change, and of course, their impacts. So next time when you're preparing for a kind of nerve-wracking meeting, or you have encountered a frustrating conversations, take a few moments just to check in. Do the pause, check in with your feelings, consider the emotions, think about the 90-second rule, and any of the other strategies that we've talked about today that might be most effective for you and for others. And just choose one of these actions to help take charge of your emotions. And of course, that's that managing emotions. We're drawing on the emotional data about ourselves and others so that we can respond more effectively rather than reactively, and design some strategies that achieve those outcomes. This includes managing those outbursts, calming fears, and of course, behaving constructively. So, Carly, we are here at the 4 o'clock mark. I just wanted to put this slide up. You'll see Insightful Communications there. I did my EQI training and accreditation through Neural Networks, which is listed up there, who are auspicing leadership and workplace reports, as well as myself. And just a resource to Deb Dana there on polyvagal theory, and there's some really nice resources about the rhythm of regulation and sharing some of those ideas that we talked about today.
Okay, that's really great.
So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. And as Jan said, we're at 3 o'clock Queensland time, 4 o'clock where Jan.
Sorry, 3 o'clock. That's right.
Yeah. So appreciate that there might be some people that need to go, but if anyone is keen to stick around and ask any questions, you have an opportunity to do that now. While you're typing those ones into the chat box, I might just go back and read through some of the comments and reflections from the previous question that Jan asked. So there were a couple that came through. Yeah. Just another couple of comments around making sure or learning to validate people's own emotions first. So that's a really good reflection, I thought. Taking the time to reflect to help develop their own awareness of how they're feeling and how they can better use it. Someone's mentioned also that the 90-second rule might be more useful than the usual 24-hour rule in replying to emails that angered them. So that's really good. Just saved a lot of time for yourself, hopefully. So some good and lots of thank yous and comments about great information, really insightful, and thank you. So that's really great. So if there's any other questions that you'd like to ask, do it now, or hold your peace. And Jan, if you had any final thoughts, you're welcome to share those as well.
Thank you, Carly. Thanks, everybody, for your comments and your participation today. It's been great to hear some of what's landed for you, how you might find some of these strategies or tools for self-regulation, emotional self-awareness and expression useful. And of course, I love that learning to validate our emotions. Remember, the number one in building our emotional intelligence is, one, the open awareness principle, and two, we manage self before we manage others' reactions. So I love that thought, and taking the time to reflect is not just a nice to have. You can actually think of it as a useful way to build your emotional intelligence. So thank you to everybody for your input and participation today. It's been great fun.
Wonderful. And Jan, there has a question has come through that might be, if you don't mind, providing some recommendations on how to approach encouraging staff, especially senior staff, to attend or learn more about emotional intelligence workshops and courses. So I guess this is sort of I guess some any tips that you might have on how to approach others so that they can engage in this kind of work for themselves.
Beautiful, lovely question. Thank you. And my first immediate response, if I take a pause and think about it, the first thing that came to mind was that we share the impact that it's having on us. So that if we can see that there is great value in exploring our emotional intelligence in the workplace, and that we have found it useful, maybe by some of the research we've done, attending webinars such as this one, having further conversations with colleagues, that we can share from that place of, it's been incredibly useful, and I can see its value in doing this more broadly across the organisation. So I think it absolutely starts with valuing what it is, talking about what you value from your own perspective and how you have found it help you, and to then use that to influence, because what you're doing is you are influencing others to come to it. It's a little bit like the leading the horse to water. And we know that not everybody is willing, but the other point, I guess, to that is that we might talk about, if we can, and develop our own emotional intelligence in that moment where we find the other person incredibly challenging, because they're not necessarily taking it as a serious request or an interest, to talk about the emotions that you feel, and in fact how those better outcomes can be had for all. So when we talk about being in it together and getting better outcomes for our clients and the people that we serve, we absolutely need to be doing this work. And so I think it's like you can take the business case of EQ, and I'm happy to share, there's loads and loads of research out there in terms of how workplaces are using it really constructively, and big departments here in New South Wales that have taken an EQI approach to their entire leadership team.
Great.
Hopefully that's helped.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. So there haven't been any more questions, so I presume everyone is just reflecting and soaking it all in, and that you've covered all of the important parts. So on that note, I'll thank you so much, Jan, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today, and also thank the audience for engaging in the polls and using the chat to sort of share your thoughts and feelings about the session and some of the tips and tools that Jan has shared. So before you do go, I'll just remind you that there is a really short survey that will pop up automatically when I close down this webinar today. So it's great if you can spend just 30 seconds to share your thoughts on the session so that we can continually improve our webinar program. You're right. And I'll thank you now for again for coming along, Jan, and for sharing your time with us. And
Thank you so much,
yeah,
Carly.
wonderful. All right, well, everyone, I'll see you at the next webinar and have a great day. Thank you.
Great pleasure. Bye bye, everybody. Thank you.